again, we're very, very happy to welcome Jonathan here. Jonathan is the director of the Icon Gallery in Birmingham, which I'm sure many of you know and have been to several times. And he has been in Birmingham for the past 12 years. And before that, he was in the 90s director of the Chisenhale Gallery here in London, curator at Serpentine Gallery before he left to direct the Sydney Biennial in the late 90s called Every Day, and has also directed two other biennials, the Shanghai Biennial and the Sharjah Biennial, and he is currently co-director of the Guangzhou Biennial.
Guangzhou Triennial, actually. It's a triennial. In Guangzhou.
So, without further ado, Jonathan Watkins.
Okay. Oh, I'm on. So, can you can hear me okay up there?
Are you on, Jonathan?
I'm on. I'm turned on. And I'm turning the lights off. And to say, actually, yes, in fact, before the things that I did, that Lisa described, I actually taught art history. University of London. I used to teach art history at Westfield College. And I studied art history. So art history is my origins. And this is the first time I've given this lecture and reflected in such a way on art history. So forgive me if it feels a little bit unrehearsed, but you really are the first. You're the first audience to have heard this soliloquy. What is this lecture going to be exactly? Well, it's not really a lecture; it's more of a talk, more of an improvisation. And please feel free to ask questions. I mean, it's been suggested perhaps that questions at the end are more convenient than at the beginning. But then, on the other hand, if there's something that is really unresolved and kind of bugging you in the middle, I don't mind if you want to interject. Certainly, what this talk is not is a concentrated dose of art history. You're not going to get prehistoric art to postmodernism in an hour and never have to attend an art history lecture again. What you are going to get is a very personal reflection on art history. You know, what it means to me and how it informs my curatorial practice now. In fact, all the work that you'll see in this sequence of images here is based on the program at Icon over the last 10 years or so. So it's very much art history and reflections on art history filtered through a program that I've devised at Icon Gallery. As you all know, or if you don't, you can imagine that art history is not a monolithic thing. There isn't one art history. There are all kinds of art history. There's every art historian has their own art history. There are various theories of art history. There are histories of art history, and the theory to which I adhere. Well, there isn't. I mean, you'll see again that I'm betraying my origins. Somebody that went to university in the 70s. My art history is a little bit Marxist, or actually in those days we distinguished between Marxian and Marxist art history, and you'd probably say that I fitted more into the former camp. Bit of a non-joiner. Marxian is the art history that I sort of started with, but I was reacting very much at the time. I was not so interested in those art histories that assumed an art for art's sake. I mean, there's the art history of Wolflin, for example, whereby there's some kind of internal dynamic that's being played out as one art movement is succeeded by another in his case. And he's just one of a number that I could cite. But in the case of Wolflin, there's the idea that this particular movement will have a sort of linear phase, be followed by a painterly phase, will be radically overturned by another movement that would begin again in its linear way and play out in a painterly way. I mean, painting is what people have been obsessed with in art history, and certainly my program at Icon is not just about painting. There is a lot of painting in there, but you know, art is a wonderful and varied thing. My art history, and I suppose you could boil it all down to the idea that with art history you're trying to account for what happened where and when. I mean, why did these things happen at this point in time in this particular place? And with the theory that I sort of grew up with and still subscribe to, I mean, I strongly believe that historical forces are largely responsible for what is manifested in artistic practice. I'm very interested in the idea that art history started somewhere because art didn't always exist, and I don't necessarily believe that art will be with us always. We're in an interesting phase, and something that I'll pick up on later in this talk. The idea of art history and the idea of history in general, I mean, it's good to know, I mean, why, if you're a practicing artist, should you study art history? Well, the idea perhaps that, without sort of historical reflection, you're doomed to repeat past mistakes forever in a kind of awful, vicious circle. I don't necessarily believe that. There is the idea, probably an idea that's subscribed to by those artists who are orbiting around someone like Donald Judd. Donald Judd's image is on the screen here, part of an exhibition that we did last year. Barnett Newman, who was a contemporary of Donald Judd, said that art history is to artists what ornithology is to the birds. And thereby suggesting that in a way you don't really need to know, and that we're involved in something which is fairly self-contained, subscribing to a sort of essentialism, if you like, and probably an art for art's sake. Donald Judd wasn't quite like that, but he would make statements like, a good chair is a good chair. It's all a bit meaningful, but the idea that it's not a good chair is a good chair. I mean, you can just kind of see that, and a good chair is a good chair irrespective of the circumstances. This was the title of our exhibition, and this is one of his very good chairs. If you say art history is to the artist what ornithology is to the birds, you probably are a modernist, and that's certainly what Donald Judd was. And the idea of modernism and modernist art history is very interesting because it's something that more or less we all subscribe to, or we certainly, we've certainly felt the effects. The idea that one movement is succeeded by another, it's all pretty linear, in a way that I was describing before, the Wolflin model of art history. There was more to the exhibition than just this chair, which I'm going to demonstrate, impress you with the. It's okay. I've got it. With installation shots. This is early Judd furniture. I mean, it's quite interesting how Judd was making furniture at the same time as his sculptures, and wanted to draw a very strong line between the two. What's the difference? I mean, essentially one's useful and the other isn't. That's how the exhibition or our exhibition spaces were populated with their furniture. And there's another very elegant view. Nobody was allowed to sit on those chairs. The modernist idea was dramatically challenged in the 70s through various movements underneath an umbrella that we now refer to as postmodernism. And postmodernism strongly rejected the idea of this linear progression. And arguably, we're talking about postmodernism when we look at the work of Turner Prize shortlisted artist Martin Boyce. I mean, he is interesting because he's looking at an artist like Judd and then playing with it. And that's the playfulness of postmodernism that we who lived through those golden years remember. You know, the idea of cutting and pasting, the sort of constant recycling of historical styles, the sort of unashamedly superficial eclecticism, because there was no longer the possibility of doing anything original or being avant-garde in a way that modernists like Donald Judd were. So we take a little bit of this, a little bit of that. I mean, if you want to kind of extend the analogy of the ornithological analogy that I was making before, then the postmodernists are kind of bowerbirds. You know, they take a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and they can bring it all in and kind of mix it up. And you could say that's precisely what Martin Boyce is doing. But he's not doing it... This is a bit like, I have to say, the beginning of this lecture is a bit like the history of furniture as much as the history of art. Because there are a lot of chairs in this sequence of slides, which is not as deliberate as you might think. But he's looking at the geometry of somebody like Judd, and he's referring to the idealism of modernism, and he's strongly suggesting that it can't hold. I mean, we all, we live in a society where an idea of technological, scientific, epistemological progress, certainly economic progress, ever increasing sort of growth towards universal wealth, it just doesn't work. Things can't get faster and faster and faster as we want to reach our ideological goals. Well, in art practice, sorry, I just keep on pressing the wrong. In art practice, I'll put this mouse over there, and Martin Boyce is obviously suggesting a kind of abject state. Something's wrong. It's a dystopia, not a utopia. You could say the same, to some extent, of Robert Orchardson, another Scottish artist. There are a lot of Scottish artists. Simon Starling is another one. Nathan Coley and Robert Orchardson, who are looking at artists like Judd and playing around theatrically in a postmodern kind of way with the aesthetic vocabulary of modernism. There's an irony in there too, of course, because they're playing with not such a playful aesthetic paradigm. Postmodernism, people don't talk about it very much, unless, of course, they go to the V&A. It's actually very interesting right now that there should be this exhibition, and I haven't seen it yet. But how much I'm looking forward to it in a nostalgic way. They were heady days, and this kind of breakthrough was it was very much on the it was very sort of hot topic, and anybody could do anything goes. That was the idea, but it became from the point of view of many, it became a movement that was sort of clever, and it was an art world talking to itself with its very interesting post-structuralist theory, the idea of the simulacra. All we dealt with were shadows of things rather than real things. And so lo and behold, another movement comes along, defined by Nicolas Bourriaud in his book Relational Aesthetics. So in my history of furniture, here is the work of Rekrit Tiravannet, a Thai artist. His chairs and tables are absolutely to be sat on. And not just that, you know, when you're sitting on them, you're doing things with them. You're making origami, you are learning how to do sort of circus tricks, you're learning lace making, magic tricks, learning how to... this isn't Rekrit, this is the expert on balloon sculpture that came and demonstrated how how inventive one could be with balloons. In an effort to engage an audience and to raise the question, you know, exactly, you know, where does the creativity lie exactly? Doesn't reside in the art world. It doesn't reside in the mind of the artist. It's there in the engagement between the artist and the audience. And there's no point in making something if you don't engage an audience. And there were years in which the audience was literally engaged. You know, they made the balloons too. They cooked the curries. They they made the origami objects and they sat on the table. And the artist didn't really. I mean, the artist sort of set up a situation, and there was a wonderful democracy that was aspired to. And to some extent, it goes on. And you can't, in many ways, you can't sort of argue with it. It's a bit chaotic, but it can be fun. This is the work of Soy Projects, another Thai group, and it's interesting actually how out of Thailand, which is something that Bourriaud doesn't talk about very much in his book, and actually Oriental cultures touch, they feature and touch on this area very significantly. And partly the reason I think that's the case is that they haven't lived with an idea of art in a Western sense for centuries. And in the case of Thailand, it crops up in the mid-19th century. In Japan, it crops up in the mid-19th century. In China, it's there for a longer period of time. But certainly they've lived with culture, making things, fine things, but without an idea of art. And the fact that we're looking at artists from Thailand, in this case, and that they should epitomize this idea of relational aesthetics is significant. Here they are actually sitting on the cushions that have been appropriated from Rekrit's exhibition at ICON. This is the group Soy Projects, and this is I mentioned origami. They're inviting people to make fruit out of cardboard as a sort of cardboard template, and the audience is invited to... It's a very wholesome project, this. They're invited to fold up their lemons and oranges and bananas, and they can take a real piece of fruit away. Lots of vitamin C in this show. Now, is it as simple as I'm suggesting? I mean, I've sort of run through in a very modernist way these three paradigms. This modernist thing, the postmodernist thing, the relational aesthetic thing. I mean, it's not as simple as that. And one is old enough to have been there when it was happening. I was there. I remember I remember late modernism. I lived through that time, and postmodernism. I remember the sort of thrill of being able to even sort of think about and use the word, and it kind of meant something, and catalogue essays were full of it. Then all of a sudden, people got rather bored with it, and it's not a word that's used very much. And then you watch another wave break, and relational aesthetics come in. But it certainly is. It's not so neat, and it's really important to reflect on the nature of art history through your current experience. That is to say, a lot of things happen spontaneously. A lot of things happen ambiguously. A lot of things happen in not such a literal way. A lot of things happen with inbuilt contradictions. There isn't necessarily a program that's somehow determining the activity of an artist, as there isn't. You know, it's not in your heads. The artists that you know don't. I mean, things happen because something struck you as a good idea at the time. Yes, historical forces are important, but don't. People get drunk. People say things. They have ideas. Under the influence of something, could be emotional, could be chemical, and then it's kind of played out. The way it's received is determined by a similar sort of range of accidents, and I think it's really important that you understand and grasp it. I mean, it's such a truism, and you think, why say it because it's so obvious? But historical artists were contemporary once, and they were operating just like we are. But their acts have been tidied up by art history, edited in such a way to make it a nice, neat, clean story, usually. And on the other hand, it's interesting for you to think about art history because you will all be historical one day. You will all, and some of you will be in art history one day, because of the quality of the courses at Slade, and I wouldn't be surprised if at least 95% of you will be in art history one day. But who writes that history? What's their agenda? I mean, they've got a bright idea, which will include some people, exclude some people. Again, I've watched the young British artist phenomenon being described and accounted for. Gregor Muir wrote a book about it. Matt Collings wrote a book about it. But, Lisa was there, I was there, a whole lot, a number of us were there. And that an awful lot of stuff isn't in those accounts. And things get written out for some reason, not because they weren't any good or because, that writer just didn't happen to bump into that person or wasn't there. I mean, they weren't friends with that person. The archetypal art historian in this respect is Vasari, who wrote the lives of the artists. It's the Renaissance art history that everything sort of springs from in terms of accounts of that time. He was a friend of Michelangelo, rather in awe of him, and it's a bit like reading Matt Collings on the Chapman brothers. They so kind of fascinating. It's kind of great to be in their company, and the thrill of it is communicated between the lines. I mean, you've got to, when you come across these art histories, and they're really, they're interesting, dynamic things, and they're very relevant when you consider the way things are being accounted for today and will be read about in the future. What are the axes that these art historians have to grind? Who commissions them? I mean, what's the bias of the publisher, too, for example? Same thing applies to people like me. Who makes these exhibitions? They don't just happen because they should, because somebody has a personal preference. And, I'm one of those people, and I'm just as flawed, or I'm just as interesting, depending on your taste, as, the art historians that you choose to or not read. Now, somebody who's interested in art history, whose background is very much along those lines, and who is a practicing artist, and who is interested very much in Donald Judd, is David Batchelor. He doesn't write as much as he used to. He's responsible for a book called Chromophobia, which I highly recommend. The last chapter is particularly great, and he's somebody that knew Judd, and he has written about Judd. He's interviewed Judd, and he produces work like this. This was, one of the versions of the stacks of light boxes that he made in around 2003, 2004. He's interested in how colour has not been sufficiently acknowledged in modernist art history. A bit like a bit like sort of neoclassical accounts, you know, looking back to what happened in Pompeii and Herculaneum and ancient Greece and whatnot. I mean, a lot of that sculpture that you see, sort of, you know, amazingly white and, you know, starkly colorless against the azure blue sky of the Mediterranean. You transported now to that place. But I mean, it was coloured. I mean, most of it was actually painted and coloured, quite luridly. And David is asking in the book, why are we ignoring this? I mean, Donald Judd was a stringent, minimal modernist, but he had a bit of a thing about his Scottish roots, and he loved wearing tartan. What is that all about? But I mean, but Donald Judd is a lot more complicated than, he's a lot more complicated than you might think. And all of these things that I'm referring to, modernism, postmodernism, and relational aesthetics, are more complex. And just assume that's the case, because we haven't got time to go into it all now, because there's so much more I want to show you. David and his interest in colour was refreshing, certainly, and then what he was interested in historically corresponded with a lot of the stuff that I was taken with too, and that subsequently we showed at Icon. So this is David's light boxes. Here is one of these sticks, which is made up of various coloured plastic containers. And this is what we showed in our last exhibition at Icon. This is the Atsuko Tanaka exhibition, a Japanese artist who died in 2005. And this is her electric dress. It was made in the mid-50s, and it was something that she actually wore as she walked onto a stage. She belonged to a sort of an avant-garde post-war artist group, the Gutai group, and she wore this work on stage, and it flashed on and off. Most spectacular piece. You can see it in the context of our exhibition here. You see it. You see it behind another dress that she wore, made of a kind of, well, it's not so bright now, bright green rayon that she took off. She took off layers and layers of clothes down to a black leotard on stage. She was really interested in movement and in colour. She became also very interested in electrical circuitry, and made the analogy between that and all the circulatory systems of the human body. These are her paintings. This one in the foreground is 1963, and this is Tanaka playing with different colours, but all the circles are the same size. You can see sort of vague anthropomorphic configurations of circles and lines in those sort of crucifix-like paintings at the back. And here's another one towards the right-hand side, her golden painting. Now she's very interesting. I mean, look at the way she works with circles. I mean, this is almost like Damien Hirst, but 30 years before. You see the painting on the left, it goes around. It's actually motorized, a sort of excitement of what you could do with new technology. And the analogy with the human body, she had been a performer, is very strong in the paintings, no matter how abstract they get. You can't ignore the fact that they have this basis in biological fact, and much more than that. But interesting is this painting by her. It's called Thanks Sam. And that is a reference to the artist Sam Francis. He was an American post-war abstract artist. And what it reflects, and this is going back to the idea of historical circumstances, is the huge influence of American culture on Japan after the war. I mean, Japan was occupied by the Americans after 1950, when the Korean War broke out. And they were kind of, it was a bit of a love-hate relationship between Japan and America, or Japan had love-hate feelings for America. Tanaka's dress, interestingly, was inspired by neon signs that she saw sort of springing up in big cities like Tokyo and Osaka. And this is her direct reference to American abstraction, with the dedication to St. Francis. Now, this is interesting because you see a kind of modernist twist. I mean, these are paintings that have as much to do with Buddhist philosophy and Japanese culture as it does, in fact, with the American abstraction to which I was referring before. And it bears very interesting correspondence with this work by a Brazilian artist. His name is Beatriz Milhazes, who is living and working today in Rio. Similarly interested in circles, but here the sort of abstraction of modernism meets tropicalia, very much a Brazilian tradition, and manifests itself in these amazingly colourful paintings, and in a way couldn't be further from the rather Protestant and sober and upright sculptures of Donald Judd. But then, she as an artist who is working and feeling the after effects of the kind of modernism that I was referring to, the Japanese artist Tanaka, and I sort of feel no lecture at Slade is complete without reference to Onkawara, so I will throw him in now, because he is someone similarly, on the face of it, working with the same stringency and puritanism, aesthetic puritanism, as Donald Judd. These are his date paintings, works that are made in one day, in a series, very systematic, feels like modernism, doesn't look very colourful. But you'll be interested to know that, and as Japanese, and is definitely not evident in this slide. He's convinced that the work is colourful from his point of view. It's a very, very subtle colour, but really very important to him. And he records these subtle, sort of dark khakis, grey greens, grey blues in a diary. Every painting has a different colour. And this is something that interests David Batchelor. And in fact, when we made this exhibition of an artist who you could arguably say, he's still alive, but sort of very much a milestone in mainstream art history, David Batchelor came to Icon and gave a lecture on colour in Onkawara's work. And here's David Batchelor again. David Batchelor he's a great artist, but also one who articulates his thoughts in an engaging way. His work with colour here, combined with the use of the ready-made, and I wanted to talk about the ready-made with respect to the observation that I made before about art history and the possibility of quite civilized and cultural life existing without the Western concept of art. The use of the ready-made, which is right there at the beginning of modernism. If you think of the Fountain by Duchamp, for example, 1917, this is, some people would say, right there in the early years of modernism. There were objects that weren't carefully crafted abstract shapes. I mean, they were sort of taken from the outside and put into the context of art, the dedicated art space, the kind of place that I work with, the kind of place that metaphorically is the natural habitat of art history. But what does it actually mean to put, to drag something from the outside? These little trolleys, they're called dollies, in fact, that you're sort of moving around heavy objects. You're moving them around in a factory or in a shop or some kind of workshop. What does it mean to put these strange sort of moving things in an art space? Because they certainly weren't made as art with the intention of them being art, but this translation into the art context then makes them consumable in every sense of the word. No, not every sense of the word, but in many senses of the word. Consumable, as art objects. I mean, consumable in that you kind of look at them, apprehend them as art objects, and you can buy them as art objects. A lot more expensive as art objects than they would be as functional objects. And it, immediately it injects into the whole the whole business of thinking about art a relativism. And it was there at the beginning of modernism. I mean, talk as much as you like about universal aesthetic values as a classicist, as a modernist. A good chair is a good chair. We don't care about art history because it's like ornithology and we're just artists and we've got, our sort of formalist principles. But actually, like a kind of worm in an apple, it's there all the time, niggling away at any idea that something is simply beautiful without consideration of the context. This then is my segue to the work of Brassard Dmitriyevich, who is an artist from the it was former Yugoslavia, so it's Serbian, from Sarajevo. This is Dmitriyevich, who makes something called the post-historical triptychs. He's been doing it since the 70s, one of those conceptualists. I'm getting something out of my bag now for dramatic effect. It's just because I forgot to take it out before. He makes these triptychs, which involve a manufactured object, a ready-made, something that was made, with a natural object, in this case a potato, or loads of potatoes, and an undoubted masterpiece, Van Gogh, an image of a potato digger. And he puts the three things together. And by doing so, immediately raises the question, what precisely is the difference? I mean, you could say, well, look, he's put the Van Gogh on top of the potatoes, and there's a hierarchy that he's suggesting. But I can tell you that that's really not the case. I mean, he is basically, and Van Gogh is a perfect person, to concentrate on. I mean, this is the artist who nobody cared about. Well, his brother cared about him, and his doctor cared about him, but hardly anybody cared about him. Didn't like him, and nobody bought his work, and thought it was pretty worthless. And now, it's the highest prices are commanded by paintings of Van Gogh. I mean, if that doesn't demonstrate relativism in art history, I don't know what does. This is how it looked in the exhibition. You see, towards the end, this is a work by Vijay Lebrun. It's late 18th century, and here is a portrait of a man by Frans Hals, and it's connected with these easels and black coats, and then these eggs. And he's holding the skull. It's a memento mori, and the eggs obviously refer to birth, but they are remarkably like the fragile skull that the man is holding, and in doing so, I mean, it's reiterating his own head and thoughts of what it all means in the much bigger scheme of things. Well, I mean, that certainly applies to art history as well. I mean, what is it exactly that we're kind of dealing with? I mean, you see things moving in and out of focus. They aren't valuable, then they are valuable. They were objects in warehouses that then were translated to the space of the museum and the gallery, and we venerate them as art. They become relics, and then the idea that a museum would buy one of those little trolleys of David Batchelor and would sort of care about the the woodworm, and every bit would have its own little sort of carefully constructed packaging, etc. I mean, what is the I mean, this isn't a lecture so much about the definition of art. And if you ask me what my definition of art was, or what it boiled down to, it probably is an anthropological thing. And why do we need it? I don't believe in it, particularly as a separate category. But I'm working with it. I'm a bit like the priest in the cathedral who doesn't believe in God. So in the case of Dmitriyevich, I mean, here is an artist who's looking at art history. He obviously likes art history, but that doesn't stop him asking really basic questions about, what is the value of this stuff? And by doing so, he makes us raise questions about, other work, and certainly what's happening in our own times. Now, it was Dmitriyevich's exhibition at Icon about 8 years ago that started me thinking about our program at Icon. Icon Gallery, Arnold Feeney, Whitechapel Serpentine, Corner House, Fruit Market in Edinburgh. All of these exhibition spaces tend to show contemporary art or modern art, tend not to show historical work. And I don't know why. Well, I think I do know why, but that was my rhetorical conclusion. But there's no reason why. I mean, there's a kind of, why don't we in our exhibition spaces mix things up a bit, like orchestras? You could have a bit of Mahler on the one hand and a bit of Howard Skempton on the other. You could show the work of a modern playwright at your National Theatre, and Shakespeare on the other hand. You can mix it up. I mean, and programs benefit from that juxtaposition. And this is literally happening in the work of Dmitriyevich, in the same space, in the same works. So I'm thinking, well, why don't we at Icon mix up our representations, our representation of contemporary art, our presentation of contemporary art with art history? And it began like this. I was in Leipzig and I was asked to do some research there with an idea that perhaps we do a bit of a Leipzig thing, because the Leipzig school was another one of those hot topics. And I latched onto the work of Christiana Baumgartner, she's in her 30s then, she's probably in her 40s now, and was making these huge woodcuts. It's very hard to see in the slide because there isn't a person there, but that's about 4-5 meters long, that work. Recently been shown at Alan Christea Gallery in Cork Street. She also makes these tiny little pieces called Eine Sekunde, where she takes the frames from video footage, the video cameras pointing out of the window of a moving car, and each frame, I think it's 25 in a second, of video footage, she makes another little woodcut. So she's translating this modern technology into this traditional medium, art historical medium, you could say, and making this sort of wonderful sequence of a quick journey from where you were 1 second ago to where you are now. This is the work sort of closer up. And I was racking my brains. At Icon we have 2 floors. It's a great benefit because we can make these sort of juxtapositions. And what other artist from Leipzig was I going to show with Christiana Baumgartner? I went into her studio. I kind of fell in love with her work. It sometimes happens, and you immediately offer this artist a show and say, you're the one. Let's do something in a year or so's time. And then I was wandering around Leipzig, thinking, well, maybe there's another Leipzig artist and we could show that artist with Christiana Baumgartner. I went to the museum and remembered that, of course, Max Klinger, late 18th, early 19th century artist, sort of came from Leipzig, and nothing that I saw in contemporary art then in Leipzig when I was doing this research sort of struck me as being, half as interesting as Klinger. Now this is a sequence of images from his series of etchings. It's called The Glove. Here is a woman. You can see in the middle of the picture there's a little dog, and then there's a woman. She's lost her glove, and they go skating, and there she is, sort of moving out towards the left-hand side. It's a very weird, sort of proto-surrealist image, according to later art historians. He picks up the glove. He's transported emotionally, kind of distraught with the distance between her and him, and he begins a journey. It's a very psychological drama, which is kind of played out in a Freudian way. His dreams of losing the glove, and can he get the glove back? And then, the glove sort of comes washing up on the tide. He's in bed dreaming, and it's as if he's sort of drowning in this excess of emotion. There is some strange monster that occurs in the series of the glove, and takes the glove away back to, if you like, the one who inspired this kind of dream nightmare sequence, and it's Cupid kind of looking rather coquettishly, intriguingly at this glove. Now that's the story of the glove, and there are other images that I can't show you because I don't have them in this particular presentation. But what you have in this work is an artist from the same town, in this tradition of woodcut and printing that Christiana Baumgartner was working also with an idea of a sequence. He has this romantic, Freudian, proto-surrealist story. She has the idea of moving from one place to another in a second with a video camera, but translating it into this traditional art historical medium. And I really felt strongly that the juxtaposition of the two enhanced, your perception of each, and certainly Christiana Baumgartner, who's very much sort of related to the tradition of printmaking in that city, enjoyed not being seen so much with a contemporary artist as an historical one. I remember now why I took out this book of Dmitriyevich, and I've just completely. If you ask me nicely at the end of this talk, I will read out the bit in this book that is incredibly pertinent to this lecture. But I'll carry on with Christiana Baumgartner and move on to another historical artist that we showed shortly afterwards, because at this point then we decided that at ICON, occasionally, once a year, for example, we put on a historical show, and in very much with a sort of deliberate correspondence with contemporary artists. This is the work of Hiroshige, Japanese artist, famous also, like Baumgartner, making journeys, making a sequence of images as he made trips around Japan. He made one group of wood blocks called Journeys to the 20-odd provinces, and they weren't odd so much, it's just that there were around 20 of them. And this is how they look in detail. Look at this amazing stylization, and for example, how the rain is represented here. We're in the middle of the 19th century. Here we are in the winter. Here we are in a beautiful fireworks display. We're in Tokyo. People shopping in a way that they do in a shopping mall, but in this sort of moonlit night. That, by the way, you see that's kind of smudge under the moon there. That's made just with ink on a thumb to give the idea of a cloud in this sort of aura of a shadow. Here's more of this, and look at the economy with which he describes sailing boat, for example. And here again, we're in a sort of wintry landscape where the paper is virtually sort of untouched in the foreground, and just showing through without ink to represent the snow. And similarly with the sort of sprinkle of stars in the sky. Now there is, with this kind of aesthetic economy, I mean, all kinds of artists sort of spring to mind, but an artist that we worked with on the selection of this Hiroshige work was Julian Opie. And Opie is an artist who very overtly refers to the work of Japanese artists. This is an early print by him, and it's one of the works that we showed in an exhibition in 2002. There's the idea of the journey again, and it's pulled through an installation. It struck me as I was putting this sequence of images together how that is almost a wonderful representation of roadkill on our first floor, with the signs of the animals in front, but behind these animals, and interestingly actually this combination of animals and humanity, here we have figures in a landscape, and again very stylized where details are omitted, and you have this very elegant sort of distillation of standing human figures that is very reminiscent. Hiroshige, as you remember, mid-19th century landscape. Opie was there curating this. Then subsequently we made an exhibition of Utamaro, an earlier Japanese artist, but he similarly extremely economical aesthetically when it comes to his description of figures. This is a woman in Tokyo, very famous at the time, a kind of Kate Moss figure, a celebrity. This is you'll see the work in the context of the installation. This is how the exhibition looked at Icon. And then here are a few close-ups. The interesting thing about Utamaro is, and actually Hiroshige as well, and a lot of this Japanese woodblock printing was very much admired by modernist artists and modernist architects. Frank Lloyd Wright had the biggest, one of the biggest and most significant collections of Japanese woodblock prints, for example. He wasn't so much probably interested in, I mean, well, I don't know, I mean, who am I to say? But, I mean, there is the elegance and this aesthetic economy that I was referring to before, but there's so much else going on in this work, and it's significant to know that all of the women that you see here are sex workers. I mean, these were images that were made in a particular part of Tokyo called Yoshiwara, and it was basically a brothel district. Not many people sort of think about that so much when they see these. So, like on it was something that we, to some extent, through our work with a feminist art historian, wanted to point up. And actually one of the, I mean, very few women write about this, and it was Julie Nelson Davis, an American academic, who talked in the catalogue that we produced very much about the predicament of these women. I mean, beyond the beauty and the elegance, you know, what was life like for them? And here then, the erotic prints that were made and not shown so much, but amazing things, an amazing sort of representation of human relations, and it's this almost kind of sort of this kind of, I refer to it as a sort of natural history, or in my head. This is sort of everyday life in a particular part of a city, you know, at a particular time in Japanese history, you know, and how did people get on? I mean, it's not just, you know, the action, but it's also the stuff that's going on around. If you look around the figures, I mean, the little objects, the evidence of etiquette and mannerisms is so telling, you know, as to how life was lived in those times. this work then gives us much more insight into the much more recent work and contemporary work of an artist like Araki, Nobuyoshi Araki, who was a subject of an exhibition at Icon in 2001. I talk about natural history, and it is certainly the way he looks at the world. I mean, it's how how do people behave? I mean, he's famous for the erotic images, but there's so much more besides. And I put this one in deliberately because of its, she's like a cat, and he's as interested in cats, his own cat, in fact, in his work. People are like animals, and it's what it is that sort of motivates them, their impulses, their instincts. He's as curious. He's looking at the world in a very unfettered way. And I think you could certainly say the same thing about Utamaro. His story is a fascinating and a sad one. His wife died tragically when young, and almost as a means, a sort of cathartic way of dealing with it, he took photographs of almost everything. And this is emphasized through our installation here of, this is only one corner of a room full of thousands of small black and white photographs that he made in Tokyo. Not only erotic, there's also this kind of stuff, like the man and his wife in a shop. This old woman holding a flower in a pot, and this image of people sort of going about their everyday lives in Tokyo now as opposed to Tokyo 200 years ago. But like Christiana Baumgartner, here is a contemporary artist who's very aware of a tradition and seeing himself not just simply, he's not sort of thinking of himself in relation to let's think other contemporary photographers. He's thinking of himself against art history as well. And our understanding, a grasp of that, informs and definitely enriches the way we apprehend the work now. Most recent exhibition, and one that we're kind of slightly famous for at the moment, is that of Thomas Buick. And I wanted to move from this. Yeah, this is my finale. This is, if you look at the way Thomas Buick similarly sort of thought of humanity as a kind of natural history, how people existed in their natural habitats, in their surroundings. This is an artist who's working at the same time as William Blake, but significantly in the context of this, in this sequence of slides, he was roughly contemporary with Utamaro. But look at the way these people are sort of getting about their business. He's working with the same tenderness and humor as Araki. Araki is, he's not so judgmental. It's just that this is what people do. And certainly the artist is there influencing things in the same way that, well, all artists favor particular views and framings. Framings is interesting in the case of Buick because he creates these vignettes that sort of bleed off the page, and how different these images are in relation or in comparison with the rectangular paintings that you normally see in galleries and museums. Buick made these works not so much for galleries and museums, but more for books. But you can say the same thing about Araki, and certainly you can say the same thing about Utamaro and Hiroshige. Here is the blind man and the child. They have a sign. It says, "Keep to this side," on the rock there, but the child can't read and the blind man can't see as they sort of move blithely past the sign towards whatever kind of awaits them. These are moral stories, and very, very sort of touching observations of a human animal. This is the amusing man who crossed the River Tyne on stilts that he attached to both his arms and legs. We showed the work, and you see his friend behind. There, he's sort of getting on his stilts. He's about to kind of follow his friend across the stream. You think, this is weird. This is this must be some kind of fantasy, but actually it's true that there was a man who did cross the Tyne with his friend on stilts like this. And Buick thought it was sort of amusing and endearing and decided to sort of communicate this to the rest of the world through his work. We showed this with the work of Harrison and Wood, two artists who often feature themselves, two people in delimited space doing strange things, normal things like listening on headphones, but then behaving in a way that sort of exaggerates a kind of strangeness. If you were a Martian and you landed on the planet, what it would be like to encounter somebody doing something to which we're habituated now, just because of the historical circumstances in which we live. This is Harrison and Wood again. We are interested, and certainly I put these slides together in such a way that you can see the difference between the pictorial space that Buick creates, the one that kind of bleeds off the page, strangely sort of coincides with our own, whereas there is this hermetic space of the studio, the white cube space, the one that we're very familiar with in our time, in art history, of Harrison and Wood. Recently I made an exhibition which is now in Hexham, near Newcastle. It's called Good Times, Bad Times and All Times Get Over. And it's so called because of this work by Buick. It's the gravestone with this inscription. I gave a lecture in Newcastle about 2 years ago, because we've made this Buick show, and I said something like, well, there's so many artists who make work that's relevant in the light of what Buick was doing. So many contemporary artists now whose work corresponds to that of Buick. And they called my bluff in Newcastle and said, okay, then, well, why don't you make an exhibition with Buick and contemporary artists? And that's then what I did. I looked at some of the prints. This is work that represents the cruelty of humanity to animals. Here is a little cat that's been set adrift in this tub, a bit like Edward Lear, but it's a cat that will it ever find its way back to land? Here's an animal that's been hanged in a tree and then encountered by this figure here on the right-hand side. This isn't Buick delighting in this phenomenon. This is Buick saying, what kind of creatures are we that do such things? This is the work of Bedwyr Williams. This is the show. Bedwyr Williams is in the middle, this little tree. It's a bonsai tree, which sort of carries on this theme of Japanese culture. And in the tree, you see this little hanged mouse. This is the work of Buick, the idea of the journey. Again, the one that I referred to before in Baumgartner, in Julian Opie, in Utamaro. You see the figure trudging across the landscape, the lonely figure on this sort of existentialist adventure. Here in the bottom, in the snow, and this is another figure in the snow. It's the kind of loneliness and the romance to some extent, but it's not a good thing of these people who are, they're not warm and indoors. And this is the work of two Swiss artists. It's a video still. It's a wonderful piece of a man who is endlessly walking through the snow. The simple Judd-like title, Man in the Snow. Here is a snowman, which is very nice in relation to this whole question of what art means. There is an inscription which you can't read. It says in perpetuum, the idea of something lasting forever. But this sculpted figure, which resembles the neoclassical sculpture to which I referred earlier, is not going to be there when the temperature climbs above freezing point. And Buick is asking precisely the same question in the 18th century, about the value of art. Certainly he doesn't think that what human beings do is particularly great, and things come and go, people come and go, like like the man in houses painting. The same thing applies to art, and arguably the same thing applies to art history. Finally, this is where it all started for me, and it's actually rather nice that there's a gravestone at the top. But I leave you with this image here. There's a little landscape at the bottom, and Thomas Buick in 1805, something like this, he's made, and you have to imagine, it's a tiny, tiny little work, but it's a print of his thumbprint, and with it, he's obliterated this carefully drawn landscape. You can see a rider on a horse moving towards the homestead on the right-hand side, but what he's done, and with this symbol of his personal identity, is obscured the whole thing. I was drawn to, somebody drew me to the attention of this work. It was an artist, a Spanish Catalan artist, Pep Agut, years ago when actually I was working at Icon Gallery, and I have to say, nothing in contemporary art strikes me as being as radical as this art historical gesture. Thank you very much.
So much, Jonathan, for that. It's absolutely extraordinary and wonderful. We're at 6:10.
I can put the lights on for you if you like. Look at that. I've mastered this. Yeah. Yeah, I don't see why it shouldn't. Because, to some extent, the phenomenon of the ready-made, I mean, this kind of little worm that is niggling away at our experience of art, and the kind of gestures that have been made subsequently by artists that I showed, the Thai artists that I showed, you know, and the involvement of the artist and the involvement of the audience. And our grasp of the fact that art itself is not a self-contained experience, and that certainly it's a truism that you know, art doesn't have a monopoly on beauty, and it doesn't have a monopoly on creativity, and it doesn't have a monopoly on emotional depth or philosophical profundity. You know, once that lesson has been properly learnt, and maybe this is a utopian idea, you know, people will start to see these things, you know, in and outside of the museum or the dedicated art space. Maybe this is a point in time where we've decided to isolate them for a kind of particular kind of concentration. But there's nothing particularly great about art, and there's a lot that's great that isn't art, and the kind of subscription to the idea that art somehow transcends everything. I mean, the Van Gogh isn't on top of the potatoes because it's better. It's you know, it's just so kind of clearly isn't. And you know, one sees, and this is a whole other lecture, you know, which maybe I'll give another time. But you know, it's so illogical to believe otherwise, but then I sound a bit like Richard Dawkins, I know, and I am, to some extent, I'm a bit like the irritating atheist who's almost kind of evangelical about it. But art is fascinating, but it's not. But you know, it's not. It's kind of clearly not, you know, better than anything else. And I think the world will grasp that fact before too long. And I'll be out of a job. Yeah. I'm very interested in outsider art, and I thought you were going to go down that road. And Kiefer is a bit of an outsider now, but he was very much an insider. I mean, it's a case in point. You know, he's inside one moment and then he's outside. You know, and he'll be back in again before you know it. I mean, these... and then, of course, you know, different people will write different sorts of art histories. I mean, there'll be an art history that definitely emphasizes the London group, for example, the Camden Road School. You know, the dismissal. I mean, and this is something that, you know, for those of us who were there will remember. I mean, how abstract art, the minimalism of Donald Judd, was completely sort of swept away by the breaking wave of figurative art in the 1980s, and Kiefer was certainly sort of part of that. So, you know, depends on the art history, depends where you are, you know, when you're thinking about it, you know, in relation to when it happened. Kiefer is not an outsider in that he's, you know, very deliberate, even thinks of himself as an artist and sets out with the idea of making art. Not an outsider in that respect. Well, is it better than anything else? Yeah, but you see, but in a way, though, if you think about the way our culture, and this is a big topic, but if you think about the way art is assumed, I mean, just look at the way the art market works, and if you like, the sort of luxury of art, the idea that fine art is assumed to be at the very top of the pyramid that is human culture, and it you know, you say that's so good, that's like a work of art. I mean, just the kind of cliches sort of reinforce the idea that somehow art is in a privileged position and somehow transcends everyday life and historical experience. And I think, in a funny way, I think we are in the process of watching it unravel.
But I think that that's maybe not just art, that could be anything.
Well, like what, though? I mean, engineering, or...
Well, I mean, fashion as well. I think it's true. I think everything. I think it could be everything.
Well, yes and no, because with art you're talking about something like it does spring out of a religious impulse in a way, and there's the idea of the art object as a sort of relic that somebody's touched. An artist, you know, has had this sort of imprint on the world.
But perhaps that's just the object itself. Perhaps objects in a way are genuinely relevant.
Yes.
And so
Yeah.
perhaps it's not just because I mean, for me, art is also a way of seeing. It's not just
Well, absolutely, but you know, museums don't collect ways of seeing. I mean, they do collect. They, you know, I understand exactly what you're saying, but that's precisely. I mean, that's an understanding then that makes the whole. I mean, the art as an institution, if you like, then starts to become undone. You know, with precisely the kind of point that you made.
Jonathan,
Yeah.
thank you so much. I think because of the time constraint,
Yeah.
we're going to have to ask, but if you want to ask another quick question